This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, my name's Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and this is the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, everything you need to know about me. The podcast, though, is, as the title suggests, we're here to talk about the stories of films. And we're talking about production stories, development stories, stories of films that had a script pretty much in place that was chucked out 5 weeks before filming was due to begin. Those kind of stories, the little tales, the little turns that go to make the films that we know and love just that. The films that we know, well, and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose for this podcast have a mainstream leaning to them. As a rule, they're films I've got interest in. I'm not really interested in firing snark at things I don't really like. And so, without further ado, I'm going to crack on with a sequel, which I quite like. I always seem to quite like more than most people, I think. I'm going to take you back to 2001, play you a clip from the film, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Mr. Udusky!
He's dead.
Oh my god. No, he's not.
No, wait. Something's not right.
Gotta help him.
Amanda! Hold on. They set a trap. They actually set a trap.
And that is a clip from Jurassic Park III, dating back to 2001, directed by Joe Johnston. The script, Michael Crichton came up with the characters. The final screenplay was credited to Peter Buckman, Alexander Payne and Jim Taylor. The film itself was, after the success of the first Jurassic Park in 1993, then the Lost World Jurassic Park happened, the sequel, that came along. It took a little while. That came along in 1997. It was a sequel too that didn't really fully capture what had made the first film work, but it did have some tremendous sequels in it, and also crucially for Universal and for Amblin Entertainment and for director Steven Spielberg, it was another monster hit. And so it was a surprise to virtually nobody. In June 1998, just over around a year after the second film came out in cinemas, a third was formally confirmed by Universal Pictures for a summer 2000 release. Straight away, it was also revealed up front that Steven Spielberg would not be returning to direct the third movie, and this was not a massive surprise. With Spielberg, outside of the Indiana Jones films, had kind of resisted quite a lot of sequel directing movies, or directing sequels to his movies. And in the case of The Lost World, I always got the sense that he'd come to regret it a little bit, that he did take it on, because he's given interviews where he said that he was kind of losing interest by the end of the film, and that was a point where, if you may recall, he was making 3 films back to back. So he went from The Lost World to Amistad to Saving Private Ryan, that he directed in a really contracted period of time. He'd had enough of directing Jurassic Park movies, and in fact he'd had enough of directing Jurassic Park movies forever. The word at the time was he would not come back and direct any further Jurassic Park movie himself. He would stay involved creatively. He's obviously the producer, executive producer, involved in developing the stories. But the search was immediately on in 1998 to find another director to take the Jurassic Park big screen franchise forward. Names in the frame. Well, Jan de Bont, who I've talked about previously when I covered Twister on a Film Stories podcast, his name was in the frame because Twister was a film that was overseen by Michael Crichton and Steven Spielberg as well, turned into a big hit. So he was one possibility. Stephen Sommers as well. Stephen Sommers had really spiked with the 1999 remake of The Mummy starring Brendan Fraser, and so he was on the shortlist for lots and lots of films at that point. But director Joe Johnston, who got history with Star Wars, or did the likes of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, he'd put his name forward to direct the second Jurassic Park film, but Spielberg had wanted to do that one himself. But when it came to Jurassic Park 3, not only did Spielberg not want to direct it, he was also off doing AI based on Stanley Kubrick, the long unfinished Stanley Kubrick project that Spielberg would pen the screenplay for and direct based on Kubrick's extensive notes. Joe Johnston thus found himself in the frame for the film, but there was still just the small matter of coming up with a story. And so when the project was first announced in the summer of 1998, the Universal put out that Michael Crichton and Steven Spielberg, Crichton of course wrote the original novel Jurassic Park and its follow-up novel, but Crichton and Spielberg were going to come up with the story for the movie. And at that point, the story that was being chucked around would have seen Sam Neill's Alan Grant return to be living on one of the InGen islands. And as they come up against this quite a lot when trying to get the script for this film sorted, they couldn't get around the idea of why would Alan Grant go by choice to return to the island where he'd nearly been killed by these dinosaurs, and so what was his to go all actorly, what was his motivation for doing it? And this whole idea of a Robinson Crusoe style story with him camping out on the island just didn't seem to make sense. The idea that did go forward was put forward by a screenwriter called Craig Rosenberg, and again developed with Spielberg. And this was the idea of a bunch of teenagers on Isla Sorna, and at the same time, a pteranodon would have escaped the island and headed to the mainland. And a parallel story there would have seen Alan Grant being recruited to investigate strange killings. And there were basically two competing narratives going on. And with 5 weeks to go before production was originally due to start in 1999, the plug was pulled. That Joe Johnston and Steven Spielberg, Johnston was in place as director at this point, Joe Johnston and Steven Spielberg looked at that idea and just thought, it just doesn't work. 5 weeks before filming was due to begin on a technically hugely complex Jurassic Park sequel. And it was left to, producer Kathleen Kennedy raised the alarm with Universal. Universal had sunk $18 million into this project at this point, and that was a stage in movie development history where $18 million, that's a lot of money. I know we tend to chuck around numbers now, films costing $150, $200 million, etc., etc. The first Jurassic Park film, I think, came in at something like $60, $70 million. So they'd spent $18 million, not got a frame of footage, and had to go back to square one. And in fact, Joe Johnston gave a really interesting interview around the time of the film's DVD release with a website called DVD File. And he described the script. He said it read like a bad episode of Friends. What happened then is with this film up against it, it clearly wasn't going to come out in the summer of 2000, but Universal wanted its film quickly. Pre-production work had begun. Stan Winston and his team were coming up with advances to present the dinosaurs on screen, and so the wheels were very much in motion. And it came to David Koepp, who was one of the screenwriters on the original Jurassic Park, who just suggested, just do something simpler. Just instead of having these two narratives running side by side, just have a straight rescue movie. And so that's what they opted to do. And in came Alexander Payne and Jim Taylor. Alexander Payne, Oscar-winning director of the likes of Sideways and Nebraska, and Election, of course, great film. They came in, they put a screenplay together, and that screenplay pulled in sequences that were abandoned from the first two films, ideas that were going to be used in those first two films. They also went back to the original Jurassic Park source novel, The House of Pteranodons has come from that. And so also what they decided was that they were going to bring back a couple of the characters from the original films. Now, Jeff Goldblum, oddly enough, wasn't asked, and he would turn up more recently in the latest Jurassic World sequel, where effectively he had about a minute of the film, which you would never guess in the trailer, because that trailer made it look like this was a Jeff Goldblum movie. But he was not asked to reprise the role of Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park 3. The people who were asked back were Sam Neill, and he was on the list from the start. They wanted to bring him back, and Neill was keen to come back as well. He'd felt that the character of Dr. Grant was unresolved really at the end of the first Jurassic Park movie. And then Laura Dern was also returning from the original film as Ellie, and they played around really with the relationship between those two characters in the original screenplays for Jurassic Park 3 that were put together. Because at one point there was a very early draft of the script that would have the whole film set against the backdrop of the pair of them splitting up, and eventually the decision was made that would just get in the way. And so when the characters when we meet the characters in Jurassic Park 3, they have split up. That's all in the past, and we don't really need to know the full innards of that story. And in fact, Laura Dern would just do a day of filming on the movie. In the end, it would just be a really very welcome cameo, whereas Sam Neill would be taking a far fuller role. Joining him in the cast in the end were William H. Macy and Tia Leone. Alessandro Nivola's in there as well. Trevor Morgan, Michael Jetta, the late Michael Jetta. What a performer that man was. In the case of Tia Leone, her casting came at an opportune moment in her life, and I had the privilege of interviewing her about this quite a while ago in a previous job role. And she described to me how her young daughter at that point had been very ill, and she'd been in hospital in 10 days with her. And, quote, once she was breathing again and going to survive, I just wanted to move forward, Leone told me. And then I remember when I read Jurassic Park 3, it was a woman who'd lost her child, albeit in a jungle with dinosaurs. And it was Spielberg personally who called Tia Leone to ask her to be in the movie. And she described it as a huge thing for her, that she thinks it's some of the best work she ever got through, and it was very close to her heart. Quote, when that weird skeletal frame, the guy in the parachute, pops out the trees, I had a blast with that. It was such a relief for me because I was so caught in the drama. The filming eventually got underway on August the 30th, 2000. This was months after it was all originally going to start, and the release date had now moved back to 2001. There was a mix of location and studio filming, and in fact the last shots, I'm going to come to this shortly, there was some early filming that took place in Hawaii, and the film at the end had to go back to Hawaii to shoot the ending for the movie that hadn't been ready when production began. I should note, before I get into the script bit, that this was still quite a practically driven production as well. That whilst there were an awful lot of advances in CG work, that the pathfinding and the groundbreaking had been done by 1993's original Jurassic Park movie, and Jurassic Park 3 felt the benefit of 8 years of technical progress that allowed them a lot more flexibility on set. But there was still a desire to do things practically. What they hadn't been able to do, however, was finish the screenplay, to the point where not only would this movie begin filming without a finished script, there's an argument it ended filming without a finished script as well, to the point where one of the stars of the movie, William H. Macy, during the production called this out, and he would give a subsequent interview where he said, we scrapped the second version of the script, which was already completely storyboarded, scheduled and budgeted to the nth degree. That was the script that they dropped 5 weeks before filming. And they did to say the story we were preparing to shoot was more complicated. It had a mainland Costa Rican parallel story going on, lots of different 5 or 6 more characters in it. And ultimately what scuppered that story was, again, how do you get Alan Grant back to the island? So the rescue narrative gave a clearer path to answering that question. But the shooting, as it would turn out, would be around 3 weeks ahead of where the script was. Hence the need to go back at great cost to shoot that finale separately when actually it could have been done at the start had the script been in place. There was location work around. I mean, quite a lot of it was done on the Universal Studios backlot in Los Angeles. But the filming pressed ahead. Macy was perceived to have been criticising the movie whilst the production was going on, and that was all played down when it ultimately came to the press interviews come the release of the film. But this was still a film up against the clock. That filming would go from the 30th of August, as I said, to the 20th of January 2001 was when they got the last shot in the can. Now, Jurassic Park films, given the intensity and the need for so much visual effects work, they're turned around with time built in to get that digital work done. But the premiere of this movie in the US was on the 16th of July 2001. So it was less than 6 months really to knit it all and lock it all together. There were still problems as well. That, for instance, John Williams wasn't able to do the score. His wonderful Jurassic work on the 2 Jurassic Park films. His recommendation, actually, it was Don Davis who took the work on, but Williams was off doing AI for Spielberg instead at the time, and so he couldn't commit to it. Then there was a marketing problem because what they didn't want to do was oversaturate this film. I mean, now they would just oversaturate this film. We're in the era where every film has 3 main trailers, umpteen clips, lots of poster reveals, and just trying to continually fuel social media. At the point Jurassic Park III was coming up for release, that wasn't a consideration. But what was a consideration is you don't want to overhammer your audience. So they didn't actually release the first trailer till a few months before the movie came out. There's also a talk, though, of an unfinished ending to Jurassic Park 3, and this goes to the finale of the film. So I'm going into light spoiler territory here, so I give you due warning. Fast forward a few minutes if you've not seen it. I don't think I'm telling you anything massively radical. Nonetheless, if you're still here, the ending of Jurassic Park 3, it sees the military coming to the island. It's all primed for a massive shootout. But the film just stops, really. And I remember watching it in the cinema. I enjoy Jurassic Park 3. I mean, it cuts away anything educational. It cuts away any of the slow build-up just for a bit of an action romp with dinosaurs, really. I remember when the first Jurassic Park film came out, Spielberg talked about wanting to educate the audience for the first 40 minutes and then taking them on a big roller coaster ride for the next hour and 20. This just went for the roller coaster ride. And, fair dues. I mean, no depth to it at all. The weird thing with the making noises through the skeleton thing, I mean that's open for debate. But nonetheless, they get to the end, and the film stops to the point where the story that was going around was it had run out of money. That this film had cost so much money to make that there was a far more extensive ending that was planned that would have seen a massive military shootout between the military and the dinosaurs. I'm not sure the dinosaurs would have shot back, to be fair. I think it would be the military doing the shooting. But the budget was up to about 95 million. But more than that, what comes across with Jurassic Park 3 is it's really, in the scheme of things, quite short. That the running time of the movie sits at 92 minutes, including credits, and it's by distance the shortest film in the series. I mean, the recent ones have been going in the other direction. And so the question that was put to director Joe Johnston at the time was something cut back? Was there something missing? And he did refute it, and it's always been refuted, really, that he said this around the time of the film's DVD release, that the longest they ever had the film was 96 minutes without the credits, and he reckons it was trimmed in the end by about 8 minutes, and you'd suggest that's pretty much the norm in post-production on a movie, that something would just be pulled back and tightened up during that process. It certainly doesn't suggest there was a more extensive ending at that point, and maybe I suspect what is more feasible is they were just writing the script while this was all going on, and they came up with the best ending they could with the ingredients at their disposal, and also, crucially, with the time at their disposal. Nonetheless, come the release of the film, it was still a success. That whilst there were a few people who lobbed bricks at it, the general acceptance of it was that this is okay. It's a fun Jurassic Park film. It was the lesser of the trilogy at that point, and some reviews were quite down on it. But it earned its money. It took in the US some $180 million. Now that's a long way down on the other movies in the franchise. They still pulled in 370 million all in, and that's at a point where, as I keep saying on these podcasts, that was a lot of money. The downside was that it didn't really advance the narrative of the franchise, although arguably, as the latter films have struggled with, where do you go with it? That ultimately it's an amusement park running amok, and if you extend that, you've got problems. Jurassic Park 3 had no intention of extending that in the end, that as soon as they'd settled on this is going to be the rescue tale, it was just a lot more straightforward. But also it left Universal really with an audience that was in decline, and a story that hadn't really left any threads for another movie to pick up. And whilst Joe Johnston gave an interview around the time saying, there was possibility of a Jurassic Park 4, the series would rest, really. Well, it would just rest for over a decade until it was director Colin Trevorrow who brought Jurassic World to the screen, which would go on to gross $2 billion worldwide at the box office, 6 times nearly the amount that Jurassic Park 3 made. I do think still that Jurassic Park 3 is a fun film and an entertaining film, and thankfully a brief film. I mean, Lord, a few films that you can just put on that are 90 minutes, that's great to me. What it didn't do, though, was really ever settle the fact that this was one of those films that was in a race against time with its own screenplay. That whilst arguably the decision was correct, those 5 weeks before production started, to put the pause on the project, perhaps another year really would have helped. Not bad, but could have been better. We're at the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. I'm going to do some plugs. I'm going to do them quickly. Please, if you can, leave a nice review for this podcast and subscribe to it. That helps enormously. Also, if you keep an eye on the Film Stories website, www.filmstories.co.uk, over the autumn, and if you're listening to this as it goes out, that's great. If not, I'm talking the autumn of 2019. I'm taking Film Stories on tour for the first time. I have a book out called The Secret Life of Movies, and I'm going around independent cinemas in the UK to just do an hour and a quarter of nerdy film chat, and then talk about magazine and the book afterwards. If you want to come along, say hello. Those tour dates will be going up on the Film Stories website in due course. Also on that website, what you will find is the first issue of our new print magazine for youngsters, Film Stories Junior. As I'm recording this podcast, it's pretty much just gone to the printers, and that magazine is now up for pre-order. It's been primarily written by under 15s. I'm really proud that it exists. I have news too on the next issue of Film Stories monthly print magazine, which is issue 7 of that is on sale now. You can find that at the website. That's a lot of plugs for one episode, though, so I'm going to move on at speed to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. It's a relatively recent one. I'm only going back to 2014 for this one. Here's a clip. I'll tell you the story the other side of this.
The world's greatest criminal has stolen the greatest treasures, escaped the greatest prisons, and he bears a strong resemblance to someone you know.
It's not easy being mean.
2014's Muppets Most Wanted, then. Directed by James Bobbin, he co-wrote the screenplay with Nicholas Stoller, and the cast for this one was led by Ricky Gervais, Ty Burrell and Tina Fey on the human side, and on the puppeteer side, Steve Whitmire, Eric Jackson, Dave Goles, Bill Barratta, David Rudman, Matt Vogel, and then there's an army of cameos in the movie as well. the origins of this one, unsurprisingly, lie with the hugely successful 2011 reboot of The Muppets. Now, Disney had snapped up The Muppets, the rights to the characters, and owned it from roughly the mid-2000s. And from that point onwards, Jason Segel had been pursuing bringing The Muppets back to the big screen. And it was a labour of love and a half for him, really, for him to do so. He'd end up starring in the movie and co-writing it, and was one of the main creative forces behind that film. He was far from the only creative force behind the film, of course, and so when Disney decided, after the box office had come in strongly for 2011's The Muppets, after it won an Oscar, the first Muppet film to win an Oscar, it decided it wanted another movie. And as such, in early 2012, it approached the key people behind the film and asked them back. So director James Bobbin, well, he agreed, and in doing so, became only the second person to direct two Muppet theatrical movies. Brian Henson being the first. He did Muppet Christmas Carol, which I covered on a previous Film Stories podcast, and Muppet Treasure Island, which I should do on a future one. Nicholas Stoller was back on script writing duties, with Bobbin co-writing this time. Brett McKenzie would come back to do the songs as well, but Jason Segel passed on the film, and he'd argued that he'd achieved his ambition with the earlier Muppets film, that it had taken him 7 years to do that, and he just wanted to move on, try other things, and pass it over to other people. It was little secret that some of the Muppets old guard, for want of a better way of putting it, weren't entirely happy with the 2011 film, and Segel, I interviewed him once, and he did say there was a little edge of him being treated as an outsider, whereas actually what he wanted to do was bring the Muppets to a whole new audience. And I think, in fairness to him, that's exactly what he did. I think the 2011 film is an absolute delight. With him out, Amy Adams, also, who'd starred in the 2011 movie, co-starred, was also not in the film. The two of them are actually, their characters do appear at the start of Muppets Most Wanted, but it's very, very overtly stand-ins that are being used, and it's not them. From the Muppets, the character Walter was now fully integrated into the world, and there's no Muppet film that really is a sequel to the other, that each independently stand alone. And in fact, Muppets Most Wanted is as close as you get to that the opening scene of it follows directly on from the Muppets, but then it just goes on to become a different film altogether. And what they opted for was a kind of cross between the Muppets and an Ocean's movie, a bit of Pink Panther, that kind of heist caper kind of thing. And that was the film they penned, that was the film they started putting together, and they found something in it. And so with that, casting got underway throughout 2012. The first person to sign up for one of the lead human roles in the movie was Christoph Waltz, and he agreed to take on the role of Jean-Pierre Napoleon, the Interpol agent who works with Sam in the movie. But he would ultimately drop out of the film. He's still in it, he has a cameo role, but scheduling difficulties meant that he quit the part, and Ty Burrell would step in and take the role on. Now go back to that 2011 Muppets film again, and there were a couple of people who were cut out of that movie altogether. Well, Danny Trejo was one, and he comes in for Muppets Most Wanted and gets a song, which he was hugely delighted with. But Ricky Gervais was also cut out of the original film. I think you can find his cameo on one of the disc releases of the Muppets. This time he was offered the lead human role in the movie and accepted, and I think I think it's fair to say that was a fairly divisive piece of casting. That some people really liked Ricky Gervais an awful lot, others questioned should he be at the head of a family movie. I thought he was perfectly fine in the film myself, but it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that initial announcement of casting did bristle a little bit. The core behind-the-scenes Muppet performers were back. Steve Whitmire, Eric Jacobson, that wonderful list of hugely creative people who I mentioned before, and thank the Lord that people like that are still going and still bringing puppeteering to the screen. But there was a notable logistical change behind the scenes, and this was a huge one. And it was the decision to shoot the film at Pinewood Studios in the UK rather than back in Los Angeles, where the last film had shot. Now, the Muppets obviously are their history is rooted in the UK. That they so much of the films and television work was done in Britain. The 2011 film wasn't, but this time it was, and the consequence of that will come to shortly. But it did add a real logistical difficulty behind the scenes of the movie. Still, in January 2013, under the announced title The Muppets Again, production began on the movie. And whilst it was based primarily at Pinewood, the film notably was one of the few to get permission to film at the Tower of London. And director James Bobbins said when they asked, they were told, "We love Kermit more than James Bond." And they were given the nod. And there aren't many films at all that get that. Whilst the film does have a rough around the world tour story, most of that production was based in the UK, and the Pinewood sets that they built, unusually for a film that required some CG work, didn't use green screen. They used blue screens instead. And when you think about it, the reason they didn't use green screen was fairly obvious, because two of the lead characters in the movie were green. So the decision was made that the story was going to be around Kermit the Frog and a doppelganger, the evil Constantine. And as a consequence of that, it sounds like such a small thing, but every little bit of the set, film sets are generally, whenever there's CG work involved, primed for green screen, and thus there's it's second nature really not to have green on the set. Blue, entirely different, and they did have someone work. I had the privilege of visiting the set for this one, and I encountered someone who was painting a paintbrush. He was painting blue specks off a paintbrush, and I asked him, we can't have any blue, it would just interfere with the technology. And so that was the minutiae of the detail that was involved with that. And the blue they needed, the reason they needed that post-production CG work is to paint out digitally the rods that are used to control the Muppets themselves. That the Muppets had moved to a rod-based system, and as a consequence there is a reasonable amount of post-production work just to digitally paint all of those rods out. The emphasis throughout, though, even though I'm talking about CG, was on practical work, and having Muppets in camera performed by human beings. And in fact, there's a sequence towards the end of Muppets Most Wanted that takes place around a wedding, where they basically had, I think they had around 100 puppeteers just working on that one scene. And if you go back to something like Labyrinth, the wonderful, wonderful Labyrinth, directed by Jim Henson, of course, there's a sequence in that where I think they have 30-40 puppet characters on screen at any one time. Muppets Most Wanted had more. It was a huge logistical effort, and there was a limit on the number of skilled puppeteers in the UK who could perform to the level required by the Muppets. And again, director James Bobbins said he thinks they pretty much got everyone together for that scene. They did it practically. They weren't cheating. But then they weren't cheating with the creation of the Muppets themselves either. They cited an entire Muppet workshop at Pinewood, where running repairs were done to the Muppets, where the costumes were put together. I mean, I discovered that most Muppets only have one costume, the exception obviously being Miss Piggy. She was dressed by Vivienne Westwood for this particular movie and had over 20 different costumes. But just putting a costume on a Muppet is a logistical effort, to the point where it sort of has to be taken apart just to be able to fit the clothing on. And there's simplicity to a lot of the hair of Muppets, and I didn't really think about this until they started talking about it all. And it is just because just the sheer logistics and hard work in getting one of these characters to work in the way they want just can't be understated at all. That huge logistical problem they got from moving the production from America to the UK, though, was one of resource. That when the 2011 film was in production, if they needed something, if there was a Muppet that needed a spare part, if there was an outfit, if there was a prop, if there was something, they could just dig into the Los Angeles archive. They could not do that with anywhere near the same speed here. And oftentimes during the production of the film, they did realise they needed something that they'd left back in Los Angeles. And as James Baldwin would say, Muppet films are heavily about preparation. So they brought an enormous amount of stuff over. I walked around it. It was an incredible amount of stuff that had been shipped over. But there were inevitably things throughout the production that they needed, and they needed fast. And it regularly, things were having to be sent from Los Angeles overnight. But it meant every time they needed something specific like that, it was a delay of 24 hours that they didn't have to contend with on the earlier film, and it was adding difficulties to the production. And in fact, if you think about it, the reverse had to happen once filming had wrapped up, that this entire workshop had to be packed up with all the new things that they built for the new film, and then it all had to be shipped back to Los Angeles. I just think one of the courier companies must have made an absolute mint off this film. Going back to actually on set and the issue of preparation and doing things practically, there's a sequence right near the start of the film where we see the character of Constantine, operated by Matt Vogel, who is going through a really intense action sequence. And again, it's one of those things that maybe you look at and you just think, well, that they must have found some kind of digital way to get around some of that, and they just didn't. And James Baldwin explained that what they had to do with that, I think it was something like 50 shots make up this sequence, and they just had to break it down and break it down and break it down and break it down and plan it to the nth degree so that they could get each individual quick shot to make that work. Because that whole thing of preparation, even if you need one of the Muppet characters to walk along the street, that takes a huge amount of work. When you're filming externally and a character has to open a door, the door handles on those doors have to be lowered, because otherwise the Muppets can't reach them. And all these considerations, it's doubly so when they go off on location, had to be factored into account. Nonetheless, production, I mean, they've been making Muppet television shows and films for an awful long time, and the people behind them absolutely know what they're doing, and the production did go on schedule and did wrap up in time. And by June of 2013, not only was the bulk of the production done, but also the film had a new title that Disney decided the Muppets again didn't really make an awful lot of sense, didn't really work for them, and so they opted for a title, Muppets Most Wanted, which is the one that we got. And with that brought a problem, because the opening sequence of the film, and I think it is absolutely glorious, is the wonderful "We're Doing a Sequel" song. And this is the bit that directly follows on from the previous film before the movie goes off completely and does something separate. I mean, it is a detached bit from this film, but a nice bridge between the two. But it ends with the characters on stage, a big Busby Berkeley influenced number saying, "It's the Muppets again, it's the Muppets again." They sing the title of what the film was supposed to be, and there were discussions when Disney rang and said, look, we're changing the title, there were discussions, what on earth do we do with that song? And in the end they did let it lie, but there were considerations of what do you do something on screen to acknowledge it, do you change the song to some degree? And they just read, no, we just got to go with it, which ultimately is exactly what they did. Now, what you find with Muppet films as well is if you buy the soundtrack CD or download, you get slightly different versions of the songs. And there was a line in there where they sing about, we're doing a sequel, how hard can it be? We can't do any worse than The Godfather 3. And that is on the soundtrack, but it is not in the film. And the reason it's in the film is simply, in hindsight, they just felt that it was a little bit mean. A little bit mean-spirited, and they didn't want it in. They thought they could probably get away with it on the score, on the soundtrack album, but not in the film itself. And amongst those who voted to exclude that line was Brett McKenzie, the person who wrote that song. There is a line, of course, in there as well where they sing about waiting for Tom Hanks to make Toy Story 4, and as it turned out, that film would be announced later that very year. So a mild amount of precedence there. The film would ultimately be released in cinemas sporting its new title in March of 2014. And this time, the response was a little bit more muted. That the reviews of the film, whilst generally positive, weren't as enthusiastic as they were for the previous film. But also there was a different release date. That The Muppets in 2011, in the US at least, was released in prime time. It was released around the Thanksgiving holiday and was positioned as a huge family movie, and the box office reflected that. Really, it wasn't the most expensive film that Disney put out, but it was a big Thanksgiving film. This one, by programming it in March, it was inevitably going to come in less. There wasn't the novelty that the Muppets were being rebooted this time, and the projections were somewhere in the region of about $20 million for the opening weekend in the US, and when it came in at $17 million, that was regarded as a disappointment. That even though the film hadn't cost a huge amount of money in the scheme of Disney things to do, its returns were lower than expected. As it would turn out, the movie, which cost around $50 million to make, would take around $80 million worldwide at the global box office. And so the questions that were firing up at that point about, is there going to be a further Muppets film? Well, by this stage, James Bobin had been hired to direct the Alice in Wonderland sequel for Disney, Alice Through the Looking Glass. And even if there was a plan to do another film beyond, and I think there was some enthusiasm for it, the box office return of Muppets Most Wanted really pretty much nixed that. And it was up against Divergent, back when Divergent was fairly big. So it was up against some fairly stiff competition when it came out. But nonetheless, it was still regarded as a financial disappointment. And I know that some people tonally have problems with the film as well, that it just feels a lot different from the one before, but that's one of the reasons I really like it. I do really like this film a lot. One thing with regards some of the post-production work, incidentally, is because they were so determined to keep things practical, there's virtually no visual effects short of painting rods out, as I previously discussed. But there's a sequence at the end where lots of human characters are stuck to the wall, where the CG work, it should be said, was clearly done in an incredible hurry, to the point where I think it's almost at the Mummy Returns level of just sticking out just how rushed it looks. And I do think that's a shame. That I think that the songs in the movie are so well tuned and so well done, and so many of the sequences in there really work particularly, and that bit just always sticks out just a little bit for me, not to the massive detriment of the movie, but I just think it's probably worth a little footnote on it. In terms of what Disney then chose to do with the Muppets, well, it decided that the big screen wasn't their immediate future, and instead it looked to develop a smaller screen outing for them, which would turn into a kind of fly-on-the-wall sitcom in the style of The Office, which lasted for one season, and it would be fair to say did not appeal to the bulk of Muppet fans. Muppet Most Wanted, ironically though, that would find more fans with the Muppet old guard who had struggled a little bit more with the 2011 The Muppets film. Brian Henson, for one, was really quite positive about Muppets Most Wanted and had nice things to say about it. But to date, it is the end of the Muppets on the big screen. Whether that carries forward is unclear, because the Muppets are characters that Disney is looking to utilise as part of its Disney Plus streaming service, to which it's investing amounts of money that would be able to snap up several small countries. And so it would be remiss to rule them out, certainly for a future feature. But as and where that would appear, particularly given that Disney's theatrical output now is focused on films that cost 9 figures at least, well, it's all a little bit up in the air, and I think the times have changed quite a lot just in the 5 years since Muppets Most Wanted came about. I, for one, remain hugely pleased that Muppets Most Wanted exists, though, and if you've not had the pleasure, do dig it out. That opening song is really some piece of work, and I just have an enormous amount of fun with it. That then has been the latest episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. Just a quick announcement. If you are one of the lovely people, and you're lovely just for listening to this, but if you're one of the lovely people who downloads and listens week by week, Film Stories is just having a short summer break, so we'll just be away for a week or two. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. I'll pop on there when the next podcast is around as well. Film Stories website, filmstories.co.uk. We're on YouTube, where there's a whole host of video film stories that are exclusive there too. That's at youtube.com/film stories. You can even find us on Facebook if you want, facebook.com/film stories online. With that, I just really want to say thank you again for everyone who supports all facets of the Film Stories project. It's enormously appreciated. And as I go into a very brief summer break, I just really want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for this for supporting this project, which is now going off in all sorts of directions. That's all down to people like you. You all take care. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back again soon with another bunch of film stories.